Early this morning, a ceasefire came into effect between the Lebanese resistance and Israeli forces, following a deal that U.S. President Joe Biden said is intended to bring about a permanent cessation of hostilities. The ceasefire provides enormous relief for the people of Lebanon who have endured death, injury, loss, suffering, and displacement on a massive scale from Israel's indiscriminate bombing targeting villages and civilian neighborhoods. It came after the resistance led by Hizballah effectively stopped Israel's ground invasion into Lebanon over the last 2 months and inflicted heavy losses on Israel's military over the last 14 months. The deal also raises many questions about the course of the confrontation between Israel and the resistance across the region, sparking concerns that Gaza faces a more difficult struggle without the support front in the north. We wanted to spend some time before we go to the rest of the show offering as much analysis as we can in these early stages of the Lebanon ceasefire deal as Israel, Biden, and the Western corporate media declare victory. What does this mean for Lebanon? What does this mean for Gaza? What does this mean for the wider axis of resistance? And what comes next? Ali, let's start. What is this ceasefire deal? What do we know about it so far?
Hi, Nora, and hello, everyone. The deal brought into effect a ceasefire early Wednesday morning. The text of the agreement itself has not been published. We do know the broad outlines and, of course, the spin that each party is putting on it. U.S. President Joe Biden announced the agreement in a speech on Tuesday evening, in which he effectively presented it as an Israeli-American victory over Hizballah, which he called a terrorist organization and which he blamed for starting the conflict. Here's a clip of what Biden said. I apologize, it's 2 minutes long, and I hate to subject people to that, but it does contain important information we need to understand and analyze. So let's look at it.
Under the deal reached today, effective at 4 a.m. tomorrow local time, the fighting across the Lebanese-Israeli border will end. This is designed to be a permanent cessation of hostilities. What is left of Hezbollah and other terrorist organizations will not be allowed, I emphasize, will not be allowed to threaten the security of Israel again. Over the next 60 days, the Lebanese army and state security forces will deploy and take control of their own territory once again. Hezbollah terrorist infrastructure in southern Lebanon will not be allowed to be rebuilt. And over the next 60 days, Israel will gradually withdraw its remaining forces. And civilians on both sides will soon be able to safely return to their communities and begin to rebuild their homes, their schools, their farms, their businesses, and their very lives. We're determined this conflict will not be just another cycle of violence. And so the United States, with the full support of France and our other allies, has pledged to work with Israel and Lebanon to ensure that this arrangement is fully implemented, the agreement totally implemented. There will be no U.S. troops deployed in southern Lebanon. This is consistent with my commitment to the American people to not put U.S. troops in combat in this conflict. Instead, we, along with France and others, will provide the necessary assistance to make sure this deal is implemented fully and effectively. Let me be clear. If Hezbollah or anyone else breaks the deal and poses a direct threat to Israel, then Israel retains the right to self-defense consistent with international law, just like any country when facing a terrorist group pledged to that country's destruction.
So, yeah.
No, go ahead.
So, yeah, you heard Biden laying it out. And what's notable here, among other things, that he says there will be no U.S. troops on the ground, but he says, quote, France and others will provide the necessary assistance to make sure this deal is implemented fully and effectively. And this suggests to me that it's possible that French or other military forces may well be sent to Lebanon to help guarantee Israel's security, which is, after all, what this is all about for the French and Americans. The other thing he says is that Israel, quote, retains the right to self-defense. And this appears to be a nod to reported assurances given by the United States to Israel that it will bless any Israeli military action in response to supposed violations by Hezbollah. And of course, the United States and Israel alone will be judge, jury, and executioner. The basic deal with Israel from the American and Israeli perspective is to say, look, if you, Israel, agree to stop killing thousands of Lebanese civilians, we will let you get away with committing genocide against Palestinians and welcome you into our midst. So that's the American view. Of course, the Lebanese government signed this deal officially, and so they support it. But there's been no official statement yet from Hezbollah.
And that's significant. What about Israel's reaction and the way that it is spinning this? It's very much, I just remember in 2006, after they clearly lost that war, they were also spinning it as a victory. What's different? What's similar about what's happening now?
Yeah. Well, the reaction in Israel has been mixed. There's been sort of a lot of anger from different quarters saying, it's a surrender deal, or we didn't defeat Hezbollah. But it's notable that Netanyahu got his cabinet to agree to it without his coalition falling apart. So that means that Israel sees it as being in its interests. And it's been reported that it is Israel that wanted this ceasefire. And Netanyahu is presenting it as an Israeli victory and a way for Israel to free itself from the northern front and focus on destroying Hamas and confronting Iran. And that logic is likely to be convincing to many Israelis. And I won't go into quoting it, but that was the gist of the message that he gave in an address to Israelis that he gave by video a couple of hours before the ceasefire was officially announced.
Mm-hmm. What about the reaction of the Palestinian resistance, particularly Hamas and the Qassam brigades? What does this mean for them and for the for the ongoing fight for the liberation of Gaza?
Well, I'll want to say more about that in a bit, but just in terms of Hamas's immediate reaction, they did put out a statement today and describing the agreement in positive terms. They reflected the sentiment across Palestinian society, thanking the Lebanese people for their enormous sacrifices on behalf of the resistance to Israel and to Palestine. And Hamas said that Israel being forced to accept a ceasefire despite not meeting its own stated goals in the war marks a significant blow to Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's ambitions of reshaping the Middle East through force. And they also called it a setback to his illusions of defeating the resistance forces or disarming them. Hamas also reiterated that it is willing to take part in any efforts to achieve a ceasefire in Gaza, which has been its position all along, and reiterated that any agreement must include a withdrawal of Israeli occupation forces, the return of displaced people, and a comprehensive prisoner exchange agreement. So that was their official reaction.
All right. And what about Iran's reaction?
Yes, of course, Iran is relevant here because they are not the puppet masters of Hamas or Hezbollah as Israeli and Western caricatures portray them, but they are obviously major allies and supporters of the resistance. Iran also welcomed the ceasefire. The need for an immediate halt to the ongoing wars against Lebanon and Gaza has always been a principal stance of the Islamic Republic of Iran. So said Foreign Ministry spokesperson Ismail Baghei after the ceasefire announcement yesterday. The Foreign Ministry spokesperson in Tehran also said Iran had made broad diplomatic efforts during the past 14 months to end the war in Gaza. So they're putting it in the context of the broader efforts to end the whole war, including the war and especially the war in Gaza. There are reports that Iran played a consultative role in the negotiations, which would not be surprising, but it's likely that Iran would have not been the final decision maker here. They would have given Hezbollah advice and perhaps had some comments that might have helped seal the deal. At least that's my reading.
Yeah. Well, as I said earlier, each side is claiming a victory. How can we assess what's really going on, and what are the things that stand out, just in these early hours after this ceasefire?
Yeah, I think it's really important to note that so far we haven't heard from Hezbollah. So mostly what we're hearing is the spin from the Americans and the Israelis and their supporters. What we can say, though, is despite the Israeli-American spin, Hezbollah was not destroyed and not defeated militarily. Despite severe setbacks, including the killing of senior leaders, most notably Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah, Hezbollah proved it is a formidable fighting force. It is at a clear disadvantage, lacking an air force similar to Israel's or major air defenses. But Hezbollah's soldiers on the ground were easily a match for the much vaunted Israeli army. Unlike in the past, Israel was barely able to occupy any Lebanese territory. And while Israel could invade and occupy Amman, Damascus, or Cairo in a few hours, it will likely never be able to occupy Beirut ever again. And notwithstanding what President Biden said, Hezbollah is not going to be disarmed. They're not going to agree to give up their weapons or place them under anyone else's authority. And so in many respects, this deal is simply a return to the terms that were reached after Israel's 2006 defeat in Lebanon, where on paper, the Lebanese army is in control, but in practice, Hezbollah remains a formidable fighting force. This is a ceasefire agreement, nothing more. It is not a peace agreement. It is not a great leap forward for the so-called Abraham Accords. And we can say, and we must say, that the Lebanese people and their resistance stood some of the worst that Israel could do to them. And Hezbollah inflicted very heavy losses on Israel for more than 14 months and fought Israel to a standstill in the south for the last 2 months. And those are rightly seen by people in Lebanon and across the region as enormous historic achievements.
Yeah. I mean, just seeing the footage in the last few hours of people returning to the villages in the south, amidst these orders from the Israeli military still barking, about do not come back to your villages, and people, very defiantly and in the great tradition of Lebanese and Palestinian people, defying those orders and coming back to their land and their homes. I know that we all want that for people in Gaza and people in the wider diaspora who have been expelled, to be able to come back to Palestine. But that was a tangent. What about Israel's ability to claim some achievements? Can it not? Can we? It's a good practice not to take anything that Israel says at face value and always be extremely skeptical. But what about any achievements we can
Yeah, there's a lot that Israel says that I think we can discard. When they claim they've destroyed 80% of Hezbollah's rockets and that kind of thing, I don't think we take that very seriously. But the main and perhaps the only strategic achievement that Israel and indeed Washington can claim, and it is not an insignificant one, is that at least for now they broke the link between the Gaza and Lebanon fronts. Recall that Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah said just days before his assassination in September that, I quote, "We say to Gallant and Netanyahu that the Lebanon front will not stop before the aggression on Gaza stops. The resistance in Lebanon won't stop supporting and assisting Gaza, the West Bank, and the oppressed peoples in these holy lands. He added that the support front would continue, quote, no matter what the consequences are, what the sacrifices are, what scenarios will unfold. And as I've said, there's no doubt that Hezbollah and the people of Lebanon made enormous sacrifices for 14 months to keep that promise. And Palestinians, including especially Palestinians in Gaza, are expressing their deep gratitude for that. There's also no doubt that Hezbollah faced consistent internal opposition. You could say that it's been fighting with one hand tied behind its back, in a sense, in Lebanon. And Hassan Nasrallah always made reference to that in his speeches, and he always addressed the opposition to Hezbollah within Lebanon. And that undoubtedly many will argue that preserving Hezbollah's weapons and allowing the group to rebuild, despite Biden's vow that it won't be allowed to, is necessary to ensure its long-term survival as a deterrent and resistance force. But as noted, we have yet to hear any analysis of the situation regarding the ceasefire from Hezbollah's own leadership. And absent that, it's understandable that people are asking a lot of questions about this and about the fact that Hezbollah did ultimately agree to a separate ceasefire with Israel, and people will want to hear their explanation as to why they thought that was necessary at this point.
Yeah. Well, that is the big question. What are the implications for Gaza and Palestine?
Well, I checked in this morning with several contacts in Gaza and asked them for their own reactions and those of people around them. And I got two prevailing sentiments. One is, as I said, profound gratitude to people in Lebanon and relief for them that they're no longer facing the immediacy of Israel's savagery. The second sentiment, which was just as strong and is really very prevalent, is the fear that this leaves Gaza more isolated and that Israel, backed by the US, the West, and complicit Arab regimes, will intensify their effort to destroy the resistance in Gaza. Describing that sentiment, one contact said that many people, quote, feel that Netanyahu will further squeeze Gaza to bring Hamas's submission in the end.
Mm. And I bracingly watched that clip that we showed earlier from Biden at the White House. And then at the end, there were reporters who were, yelling as he was wandering off. What about Gaza? What does this mean for Gaza's ceasefire? What did Biden say about a Gaza ceasefire, and does it say anything differently in this context?
Well, let's take a look at another clip from his speech on Tuesday night. And I apologize again, it's another 2-minute clip, but it does cover a lot of important ground. So let's watch Biden.
People of Gaza have been through hell. Their world's absolutely shattered. Far too many civilians in Gaza have suffered, far too much. And Hamas has refused for months and months to negotiate a good faith ceasefire and a hostage deal. And so now Hamas has a choice to make. Their only way out is to release the hostages, including American citizens, which they hold. In the process, bring an end to the fighting, which would make possible a surge of humanitarian relief. Over the coming days, the United States will make another push with Turkey, Egypt, Qatar, Israel, and others to achieve a ceasefire in Gaza. With the hostages released and the end of the war without Hamas in power, that becomes possible. As for the broader Middle East region, today's announcement brings us closer to realizing the affirmative agenda that I've been pushing forward during my entire presidency. A vision for the future of the Middle East where it's at peace and prosperous and integrated across borders. A future where Palestinians have a state of their own, one that fulfills its people's legitimate aspirations. one that cannot threaten Israel or harbor terrorist groups with backing from Iran. A future where Israelis and Palestinians enjoy equal measures of security, prosperity, and yes, dignity. To that end, the United States remains prepared to conclude a set of historic deals with Saudi Arabia, to include a security pact and economic assurances, together with a credible pathway for establishing a Palestinian state and the full normalization of relations between Saudi Arabia and Israel.
Again, the American position has always been full surrender to Israel, and he really admitted that the withholding of food and medical supplies and blankets and water and everything that is fuel, everything that's needed to sustain life in Gaza is being withheld because of Hamas's refusal to surrender to Israel's genocide and barbarity. I mean, it's sickening. But what is what does this mean? Is this obviously this is not really a change in position at any level, but what does this mean?
Yeah, what he did say there is that the people of Gaza have been through hell, and he's right about that. But the part he didn't say is that Joe Biden is principally responsible for putting them through hell. He is Genocide Joe. He's called Genocide Joe for a reason. But aside from that, on its face, this is a repetition of long-standing U.S. positions. And it's not clear that there's anything new that could facilitate a deal in Gaza. There's no indication that Israel wants a deal in Gaza. And the consistent position, and I have no doubt that Netanyahu is telling the truth for a change when he says this, is that he really does want to be free of the Northern Front in order to concentrate on Gaza. So without a change in the position of Israel's sponsors, I don't see this as anything other than an indication that the US and Israel still hope that isolating Hamas by breaking the link with Lebanon will force it to surrender. And you can see the reason I ran those longer comments is because you can see that the US is still harboring this ambition of normalization of Israel's genocidal regime in the region and expanding the so-called Abraham Accords to include Saudi Arabia, and doing all this under continued US dominance and hegemony. And really, the only thing standing between that now is the resistance in Gaza and the regional support for it, minus, at least for the time being, the front in Lebanon. It's also notable for the first time we see Turkey added into the mix of mediators. We've been used to hearing about Egypt and Qatar. This is the first time we hear Turkey coming in. And it's really unclear what that means, given the vehemence of Turkey's rhetorical position against Israel and rhetorical support for Hamas. Turkey's rhetoric has been very strong in support of the resistance, but to me it's unclear whether Turkey, which we must not forget is still a member of NATO, is going to be a counterbalance to US and Israeli pressure on Hamas, or join in the pressure on them to accept a deal that falls short of their minimum demands. It seems very strange to me that the US or Israel would allow Turkey into the mix if there wasn't something being cooked up. And so I'm very wary of that, but we don't know.
Yeah. There have been developments with the ICC arrest warrants that appear related to the Lebanon deal. What are they? What do we know about them?
Yeah, and this is why I'll explain why this adds to my suspicions regarding the inclusion of Turkey. But basically, Wednesday morning, the day after the ceasefire was announced, France announced that it will not arrest Benjamin Netanyahu. It will not apply the ICC, the International Criminal Court arrest warrants. And the foreign ministry issued a statement this morning in Paris saying France will comply with its international obligations, it being understood that the Rome Statute demands full cooperation with the International Criminal Court and also stipulates that the state cannot be required to act inconsistently with its obligations under international law with respect to the immunities of states not party to the ICC. Such immunities apply to Prime Minister Netanyahu and other ministers concerned and will have to be taken into account should the ICC request of us their arrest and surrender. This is really a shocking new invention, made up, a legal notion that doesn't exist in the Rome Statute, that states that are not parties to the International Criminal Court are somehow immune. That is absolutely contrary to the Rome Statute. The International Criminal Court derives its jurisdiction over this matter, the situation in Palestine, because it recognizes Palestine as a member state of the ICC, and therefore anyone who commits a crime on the territory of Palestine as recognized by the ICC is subject to its jurisdiction, and heads of state and heads of government do not have immunity. And you know who held that position until like 5 seconds ago? Take a guess.
I can't even imagine who.
Right. So in September, Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia, who is also the subject of an ICC arrest warrant, went to visit Mongolia, which is a member of the ICC. Russia is not a member of the ICC. It's one of a handful of countries that are not. And the French Foreign Ministry spokesperson was asked at the time whether Mongolia should arrest Putin when he arrived on its territory. And the French Foreign Ministry said, this was in September, each state party to the Rome Statute has an obligation to cooperate with the International Criminal Court and execute the arrest warrants it issues in accordance with the relevant provisions of the Rome Statute. So there's one law for Vladimir Putin, who's the president of a country that is not a member of the ICC, and another law for Israel, apparently.
Yeah. What can we say about why France would make this kind of shift, this real digging in of hypocrisy and double standards, which they are historically fond of?
Well, it's not coincidental. It appears to be tied to this Lebanon agreement. There's no suggestion or evidence that Hizballah or the Lebanese government had anything to do with this aspect, but it seems to be a quid pro quo between France, Israel, and the United States. And it was reported in the Israeli newspaper Ma'ariv, which is one of the largest circulation newspapers in Israel, that, and I think we can show, that's those screenshots are machine translated. This is originally in Hebrew, but I posted these on my Twitter account. And basically what the Ma'ariv story reports, citing two senior officials, is that France was always a party. It's a member of this so-called monitoring committee for the ceasefire in Lebanon, along with the United States. So France gets to play with the big boys. But when the arrest warrants were issued last week for Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant, the former defense minister, and France said that it would follow the law, Netanyahu was enraged. He told the Americans that there's no way France can be involved in this. We're not going to allow France to be part of this if they take action against us. So according to Ma'ariv, that was the quid pro quo. France drops any obligation or agrees to renege on its obligation to arrest Netanyahu, and in exchange, France gets to claim credit for this Lebanon deal and be part of the monitoring committee and the implementation. And it's clear that this outrageous position invented by France is probably going to be followed by the rest of the West as well. There were already indications this morning that the British might be following suit. And you'll recall in our discussion last week that the Italians were saying, oh, we have to come up with a unified position. I'm betting this is going to be the unified position. Yeah. And it's a complete trashing of the ICC. Again, we're seeing that the West, the collective West or whatever, will trash any international institution rather than allow their darling genocidal Israeli regime to be held to any sort of account.
Thanks for that overview, Ali. I know there will be a lot more coming up in the next days and weeks, and obviously we'll be covering more in depth next week's show. But John, I wanted to ask you specifically about what you've been watching, how you are analyzing what's been going on the last 24 hours in the context of this ceasefire deal, and in the context of Hezbollah's, power in the battlefield leading up to this.
Yeah, I mean, I go into it later in the show at length. Hezbollah at this point is fighting from a position of strength. This is a ceasefire from a position of strength. Israel's unable to advance, unable to occupy. They're running out of ammunition. Their troops are exhausted. They could not widen the war. And so they were really in a position of needing a ceasefire. It looked as though, and from Israeli military comments internally over the last few weeks, that they were going to push towards a unilateral ceasefire. They were unable to continue the war. Like I said, they were unable to advance. The toll that it would require to advance through Hezbollah's defenses in South Lebanon were not something the Israeli army were up to. I've been documenting that on this program every single week for many, many months. Israel's not up to the battle, and Netanyahu essentially admitted the same. He said they're out of ammo, their troops are tired, they need to call up thousands of more troops because of their wounded troops and troops that didn't come back to serve in their reserve duty. They're unable to win the war in Gaza, and I think that's the part that scares us all, is that they are doing this move because they cannot win in Lebanon and they are not winning in Gaza. And so now, as Netanyahu said, this will allow them to focus, to rest, to recuperate, to resupply, to get their equipment is part of the resupply, to get the equipment that the Americans are giving them in these land and these air bridges delivered every single day, in order to beef up the genocide in Gaza, because 14 months on, coming up on the 15th month, and they're unable to defeat the people of Gaza, despite the fact that they've carried out the most brutal aggression in modern history. So I think it's worrisome from the point of view of people in Gaza. I mean, I think that's my personal reaction to this. But it's clear from a military analysis that there was no other option for Israel. There's no stalemate where Israel remains inside Lebanon. They were being hit every single day. In my report later on in the show, I'm going to detail the most operations of any day of the war just happened on Sunday. There's been more than 100 Hezbollah operations over the last 72 hours. They're striking deeper into Israel than ever before. They're using more qualitative weapons that they're introducing to the battle. And like Ali said, this 80% of their rockets are knocked out is nonsense. And what is in reality the truth is that they have hundreds of thousands of more of them that could be steered on Israel. Hezbollah does not want an open war. They had said that right from the start. Nasrallah said that all through the beginning stages. They're not looking for an open war to destroy Lebanon. They take that responsibility very seriously, and they have throughout the war. But they have the capacity to do that. And so Israel needed a way out. And on Sunday, when there's buildings burning in Tel Aviv and key air bases being struck, And Israel has no, I mean, I've showed it week after week that Israel is not advancing in Lebanon. They're not able to occupy Lebanon. And so I think that a unilateral ceasefire was likely in the offing if it weren't for the Lebanese government accepting the ceasefire proposal. And as Ali laid out very well in the introduction, there's still much more to be learned about this. And this is just our initial reactions at this point.
What does this mean for the broader axis of resistance? Like, where does Yemen fit into this? Where does Iraq fit into this? What, it's hard not to speculate, obviously, but, what about Iran as well?
These are major questions that still are not answered. Ansar Allah and the Yemeni armed forces have promised to blockade Israel until Gaza is free of the siege on Gaza. And what we're seeing today in Gaza is the opposite of that. So there's no indication that Ansar Allah are going to step down in this situation. The Iraqi resistance is hitting Israel daily with multiple drones. No indication, haven't heard anything from them on that front as well. I think Ali laid out the diplomatic position of Iran. It's not clear where their tit for tat, if you will, with Israel is at. Iran said that they were going to respond to that. That's unclear. There's many questions to be answered, including primarily the document itself, to see what the document says and what is expected of people at this point. There's no doubt that the Lebanese are happy that this part of the war, as it is today, as you saw, we saw it immediately from the first sunrise this morning. It went into effect at 4 a.m. and by sunrise, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people were on the move back to their homes. And I was in Lebanon in 2006 when that happened, and it was a remarkable moment. People going back to their homes, of course, is a very symbolic and important facet of the war with the Israelis, who constantly are driving people from their homes and hoping that they don't return. So it's a significant victory when civilians are able to return to their homes. And as you said, and you pointed out, Nora, that's something that we want to see in Gaza as well.
Yeah. And where does this, you'll get into this more in your report, but finally, talk about the capabilities of the resistance in Gaza. What have we seen in the last, 24 hours that would indicate whether, Qassam has been forced, into any sort of submissive position or not?
No, there's still consistent operations every day. There's 10 operations yesterday. There was a dozen the day before. Constantly, the Joint Operations Room is hitting the Netzarim corridor, which I'll get into later on in the program as well. And later in the program, you're going to see a dozen qualitative operations by the resistance in Gaza. And there was another one today on video, and we don't see any signs of defeat of the resistance. What we see is signs of a brutal genocide, like how Ali says, a Holocaust, scorched earth that's happening in Beit Lahia, Beit Hanun, and the siege on Jabalia, which is the center of resistance for the Palestinians and has been since the armed struggle began. There's no Jabalia is not going to surrender. Gaza is not going to surrender. So the fight will continue.
Yeah. Thanks for that, John. And Asa, I know you've been looking at this very carefully. You wrote a piece recently about the destabilization, attrition that the Israeli military itself is having. Can you talk about that in the context of Israel's defeat in Lebanon? And what you're watching closely.
Yeah, I think regular viewers of the show will know, and especially of John's segments will know that the maps that we're seeing in the news right now of, supposed Israeli ground troops withdrawal from Lebanon are really misleading, because they never held any territory in Lebanon in the first place. And we can see the reason for that. It was alluded to in Netanyahu's speech. He said one of the reasons he gave just for this ceasefire, arguing for the ceasefire, in Hebrew, in his own constituency, is, quote, the second reason is to give our forces a breather and replenish stocks. So he's not just referring to weapons, he's referring to his soldiers. And they have, as Ali said, and as John has been covering for the last 2 months, the Israeli army was completely defeated in Lebanon. And a big part of the reason for that was because it was completely defeated in Lebanon on the ground. We're not talking about the air war. And a large part of the reason for that is because of the Palestinian armed groups in Gaza. And this is the article that I wrote, and it's about the fact that the Israeli army has been on the verge of collapse for a long time, for months and months. And in this article, we mentioned it before in a previous discussion. What it says here in this Israeli, in this publication, Tel Aviv publication, interviews with Israeli soldiers and families, quote, there was a constant hidden dropping out from fighting, said a mother of one of the soldiers. This is not conscientious objection, but rather dropping out due to burnout. The army's morale was already catastrophically low even before Israel carried out a series of assassinations in Lebanon ahead of the attempted ground invasion that began on the 1st of October. Her son told her that, quote, I don't know what army they're planning to go into Lebanon with, but there is no army. I'm not going back to the battalion. And so we can see the results of that. Israel has been forced into this, into dropping out from the ground war in Lebanon. That's the result of it.
And you've been also monitoring the declarations by Israel's political leadership about, encouraging their settlers to return to the settlement colonies in the north of occupied historic Palestine, which have been pounded for the last 14 months by Hizballah, as well as the settlements around the so-called Gaza envelope. What's actually happening? How many settlers are going back, and are they even able to?
Yeah, this is another justification that Netanyahu gave, another one of the flagrant lies that he told in his speech. He said, quote, the war will not end until we realize all its goals, including the return of the residents of the north safely home. And I tell you, it will happen just like it happened in the south. I mean, that's just, so he's saying there that he wants the residents in northern occupied Palestine, near to the border with Lebanon, he wants them to return to their homes because certainly tens of thousands have been evacuated, but for more than a year from their homes. They haven't been able to return to their settlements. And, he's saying that, well, it's started to happen in the south, in the Gaza envelope. In reality, this is simply not the case. All of the settlements and in the south, the residents have not returned to their homes. There's been very, very few people returning to their homes, and we can see that in the Israeli press and in the pro-Israeli press. We have this story from last month, the beginning of last month, in Britain's Jewish Chronicle, reporting from Kfar Aza, which is an Israeli settlement named Gaza Village. It's talking about how it's essentially saying none of the settlers have returned to Kfar Aza. That the settlement buildings are shells. It says for the past 12 months, most of the residents of Kfar Aza have been living in a resort close to Tel Aviv. A temporary kibbutz has been set up. and they will be living in caravans for the foreseeable future. A few residents have gone back. Barbara Cohen, a Brit who moved to Gaza 40 years ago when she was 19, is working there in the gardens. But aside from that, very, very few of the Gaza envelope settlers have gone back. There are figures.
Yeah.
The latest figures I'll be able to find on that is that, as many as 120,000 Israelis from the Gaza envelope were from the Gaza envelope and the northern border combined were evacuated, and for the ones who have moved back or are going to be moved back, it seems that the Israeli government is essentially trying to bribe them into going back. We don't see that happening in Lebanon.
Well, there is a lot we will see in the coming hours, days, months.